All right. So, well, Deanne, I think summed up me and what this is about. And I have to say I'm glad to see a couple of other Safe Wings volunteers here tonight. I noticed Jeanette and Susan Phillips. I don't know if there's others, but everybody, thank you for joining me. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is why birds collide with glass, what makes buildings dangerous. I'll touch on light pollution just briefly, and then talk about preventing collisions and more about what Safe Wings does exactly and how you and all of us can help birds. So it's a really big statistic, but glass is estimated to kill 1 billion birds per year in North America alone, more in the rest of the world, of course. That's such a huge number. It's very abstract. One of the reasons, this is a photo of our annual display, well, which we haven't been able to do the last couple of years, but annual display we've done of window collision victims that we have collected, which is just a tiny fraction of them, because this sort of brings that home to people. You know, 1 billion is a huge number, but here you can kind of see the effects of it more concretely. In contrast, wind turbines are estimated to kill fewer than 1 million birds per year in North America. And I like to bring that up. We're not in, you know, it's not a competition. There's all kinds of threats to birds. But often people say, well, why aren't you doing something about wind turbines? Because those are killing all the birds. And well, it's not that wind turbines aren't dangerous to birds. It's just there's far fewer of them than there are buildings with glass. So the problem is still, you know, magnitudes smaller than it is with windows. Of all the human-related threats to birds, only cats are thought to kill more birds than windows do. But there's one thing that people don't really mention, and I don't think anybody's actually ever done a study on it. But people who research window collisions tend to think that there's probably a lot of birds that the cats are blamed for killing that probably hit a window first, because, you know, birds will often be injured by the collision, or they may already be dead, and a cat comes along just like other predators might, and takes that bird. And then the bird, you know, is seen in the cat's mouth, so the cat is blamed. But it's quite possible that there's a significant number of birds that that are actually killed by, that are hitting windows before the cats get to them. So I'd like to bring that up as well, just for context. So in Ottawa, as you know, we have been studying this since 2014. Every year we're finding more birds, not because there's necessarily more collisions, but because we have more volunteers who are helping us and members of the public who are reporting these collisions to us. So we have better records. Last year, we documented 4,701 collisions that represented 125 different species. Since we started, we have documented 146 different species colliding with windows, which is a pretty significant portion of all the bird species that one finds in Ottawa. And when you consider that there's certain families of birds that are much more likely to be colliding with windows, like songbirds, it means that we're, you know, we've actually documented almost all the songbirds at this point that have collided. And that includes 14 different species at risk. 4,700 sounds like, well, maybe it sounds like a big number to you, maybe it sounds like a small number compared to 1 billion. But one thing to remember is that we're volunteers monitoring buildings. We're not there all the time. So we estimate that we're only documenting about 5 to 15% of the birds that are actually colliding at the buildings that we're monitoring. So never mind all the other buildings that we're not monitoring, like your house. You probably wouldn't be happy if our volunteers were checking out your backyard. The worst known building in Ottawa, and I say the worst known one because there could be worse ones. There's certain ones that we monitor because we're able to, and other ones we may not even know about. But the worst one that we know of kills about 7,000 birds per year, we think. We usually find about 300 or so on average per year. For the entire city of Ottawa, we have a conservative estimate of 250,000 birds per year. It's really hard to come up with exact numbers, and that's why you see these ranges, because most collisions never get noticed. So we can only count the ones that we know of and extrapolate from our data to figure out what the total might be. So we say 250,000. It could be significantly more. It's probably not less than that. So why is this such a problem, birds colliding with windows? Well, it's a problem that's gotten much, much worse over the last, say, 100 years or so, but especially in the last 50 years. And that's because, we have a really big love affair with glass. So if you look at these photos, they're showing old buildings and they're showing new buildings. And one of the big differences you can see is just the amount of glass that's being used. The old Victorian cottage there, it's got windows, but the big modern house has, is much more window in that. It's a bigger house as well. But there's just a lot more glass there. And the same thing with apartment buildings, and it's the same thing with office buildings. Everything has more glass these days. So with all these birds dying from hitting windows, you got to wonder, where are they? Because I don't know if you've ever seen any, maybe you've seen one or two. But when we're talking about those kinds of numbers, people wonder, well, can that actually be real? Because we're not, you'd think you'd be tripping over them all the time. Well, the truth is that most of the birds that collide don't get counted, they don't get noticed, they get eaten by predators and scavengers. You can see in this photo, there's a crow that's sitting by our favorite building, the one that kills about 7,000 a year. And they just wait there because they're smart. The gulls do this too, the ring-billed gulls, the crows. You can see there's a fox in one of the photos, and they just sit by these buildings and they wait for birds to collide so that they can get an easy meal. I mentioned cats earlier, they do the same thing. Squirrels do it, raccoons, chipmunks, they all take advantage of an easy meal when they can get it. Other birds that collide just land in places where nobody notices them. They fall onto rooftops and overhangs, they land in the bushes. Sometimes people see them and then they think it's sad, so they move the bird aside, they put it in the garbage if it's dead. If it's alive, they put it somewhere and they hope for the best. And a lot of the survivors, in fact, fly away and they die elsewhere. Because if they hit a building, they're very vulnerable to these predators. So as soon as they can, if they can, they will fly away. And people often think that the bird is fine when they do that, but that's not our experience. Most of them have internal injuries, and so they will fly away and in all likelihood will die somewhere else. So where again, we don't see them. So when birds collide, right off the bat, about 70% of them that we find die on impact. The ones that survive usually have some pretty terrible injuries. Very typical ones are head trauma, concussions. They can have internal bleeding in the brain or elsewhere in the body. Eye injuries. There was a study that was done a couple of years ago that found that the vast majority of birds colliding with windows ended up with corneal ulcers. So that affects their vision and will of course affect their chances of evading predators and of just surviving in general. So like I said, many of the ones that do survive the collision initially will die from their injuries, they'll get preyed on, or in a lot of cases they'll starve because they just can't manage to forage for food anymore, or if they're predators themselves, they won't be able to hunt. And these are 3 birds that survived the collision, and these are sort of typical poses. You can see that one of them looks like it's just very, very, actually 2 of them look very concussed. And the cardinal there looks like it might also have, some kind of internal injuries that are affecting its muscle control. It could have spinal trauma. So why does this matter? I mean, you probably like birds, I like birds, and we want to save birds. But it's not just because we like birds, it's because birds also play an incredibly important role in our ecosystems. They do a lot of pest control. People don't often realize this, but the forest industry actually benefits greatly from birds like woodpeckers and other nuthatches and things like that that eat pests. And in fact, they found that where there are fewer birds, the quality of the lumber decreases because of that, because there's more pests in the wood. They do environmental cleanup, like turkey vultures. Turkey vultures are one of the few organisms that can actually process botulism and other things. So they actually take bad things out of the environment for us. They do pollination. We think of bees as being pollinators and other insects, but in fact, hummingbirds and orioles and a lot of other birds that drink nectar from fruits, they also do pollination. They disperse seeds, so they eat, whether it's crab apples or berries or whatever in one place, and they fly somewhere else and they poop out those seeds, and that way they propagate all kinds of plants. And birds are, of course, a really important part of the food chain in the sense that they feed on other things, and other things feed on them, including other birds, as you can see from this Cooper's hawk eating a pigeon, I believe. And this all really matters because in the last 50 years, North America has lost about 30% of its birds. We're down 2.9 billion birds, and that's in, you know, sort of overall numbers, and those are like healthy breeding birds. And if you look at this graphic here, it shows how waterfowl and birds of prey, the numbers have gone up. Big part of that is reductions in pesticides like DDT. And at the bottom there, you can see that it's grassland birds and aerial insectivores are the ones that are the most declined. And not coincidentally, I mean, there's various reasons for this, and certainly different kinds of pesticides are responsible for that to a great degree. But those are also the birds that we find the most that are dying from window collisions. So all of this matters a lot if we, you know, we need to fix windows if we want to protect the birds. So why do they collide with glass? It's not because they're dumb. There's really logical reasons why this happens. So glass to birds is invisible. It's not a natural material. There's nothing like it in nature. There's no like sort of vertical surface that is reflective and or transparent. So birds just don't understand how glass works. If it's transparent glass, they just don't see it and they think that they can fly through it. And they're also fooled by reflections. So if they see reflections of things in glass, to them, it's just real because reflections don't exist in their world, at least not in that sense. So just looking at a few of the examples of how transparent glass is dangerous to birds and what types of transparent glass. Glass walkways are a really good example. The top photo is the walkway at the National Gallery, which since that photo was taken has actually been treated to make it bird safe. And in the, I think 2 years since that was done, we've only found one dead bird there. That was quite recently. But glass walkways like that are incredibly dangerous because you've got this clear glass structure that's between two buildings with trees on either side. And the birds are naturally going to just want to fly from one tree to the other and between those buildings. And instead they hit the glass in the middle. Now that's a really big example. The lower photo is a different glass walkway. They come in all shapes and sizes. They're all dangerous to birds, especially when there's vegetation around that they can see through the walkway. Glass railing panels, we're seeing those more and more. We're seeing them in homes. We're seeing them on viewing platforms. We're seeing them all over the place, and they're really, really awful. They're incredibly popular, and people often don't realize that they're going to kill birds until, you know, they've bought their new house with the glass railings, or they build a new deck and they put in glass railings, and then they're horrified to realize that it's killing all these birds. The same as with the glass walkways. The birds can see vegetation through there, whether it's a plant on a balcony or, you know, the river bank here. That's near Perth that the lower photo is taken at. And they just don't see that obstacle in the way. Indoor vegetation is another threat. So if you have plants inside that can be seen from outside and those are attractive to birds, the birds will try to fly to them. They're looking for shelter, they're looking for food. And again, they don't realize that there's that transparent obstacle there. Corners with glass on both sides. So corner windows, but it can also be in, you know, sunrooms and things like that. Same reason they will try to get from point A to point B and the glass is in their way. But really any kind of glass that is in the flight path of a bird can be dangerous. So, you know, these steps here with the glass railing, a bus shelter, all of those things are examples of transparent glass that is lethal to birds. Reflections. I already explained how sort of, you know, reflections look real to birds. So if they see a tree reflected in glass, it's a tree to them. And you can see in the top photo that there's some mirrored glass there. For the birds, it's just an extension of their habitat. The interesting thing is that, you know, we tend to think of glass as being either transparent or reflective, but pretty much all glass is reflective under certain conditions. So even if it's low reflectance glass, it's still going to be dangerous to birds at some point from the reflections, but also you can have glass. If you look at the photo in the lower left, there's an example of glass that's being transparent and reflective at the same time. So you can see through a corner of that house, and you can also see a reflection of a tree in that glass. So it's important when looking at, you know, making a building bird safe to look at all those angles. Often we don't realize where those reflections are and where that transparency is. But if you stand outside a building and look in different times of day, then you can kind of see where the problems are. So Zian, this is for you. Zian was mentioning earlier about a cardinal that was tapping at her window. And we hear this a lot, you know, there's these birds, I swear to God, they're crashing into my window on purpose. They're tapping on my car mirror, they're flying hard into the side of my window in my house. Why are they doing this? Well, this is sort of a different issue. It can have the same effects because birds can be badly injured from this. But what you get is territorial birds like cardinals and robins are the typical examples that we see locally. During the breeding season, they are very aggressive. They want to fight off rivals. So when they see their own reflection, they think it's a rival, and because they don't understand reflections, and they attack it. Sometimes it's just light tapping, but sometimes it can be pretty violent collisions that they're doing. Now, the good thing about this is that it's a short-term problem, and you can stop them from doing it by covering up the glass that they're attacking. And usually if you just cover the outside of the window or your car mirrors, sometimes people will just put a bag over the car mirrors, but with a window, if you can put, you know, paper up on the outside, wax paper will still let light in, whitewash it, just something to get rid of those reflections that are fooling those birds. So if you look at these two buildings, I mean, can you guess which one is probably more dangerous to birds? I bet you can. The Parliament buildings there, that's an old building. There's a lot of stone. There's not a lot of glass. There's a huge, you know, plaza in front of it also where you're not going to get a lot of birds hanging around. The second building is mirrored glass, and it's surrounded by trees, and it's also near water. It's close to the river as well. That's just a creek there, but there's also the river nearby. And those are all features that are going to attract birds and increase the likelihood of collisions. So there's, you know, definitely any building can be somewhat dangerous in different circumstances, but there's definitely buildings that are much worse than other ones. So let's just talk about types of buildings. People often associate bird collisions with high rises. I don't know where that idea came from. Probably because early research done into bird collisions and when people became aware of it was in places with lots of high rises like Toronto and New York and Chicago, where people started studying it, and they would find a lot of birds around high rises. Well, high rises are dangerous to birds. Just because of their size, they can certainly kill a lot of birds. But the thing is, it's sort of like the wind turbines. There's not really that many high rises compared to all the houses and all the low-rise buildings out there. So high rises, in fact, are responsible for fewer than 1% of collisions. Residences and low rises make up the rest. It's about half and half, although it depends what study you look at. it's, like I said, it's hard always to get exact numbers on bird collisions for various reasons. And some buildings have found that low-rise sort of office buildings in like business parks or tech parks are the worst ones because they tend to be in natural settings. And other ones have found that, well, houses are almost as bad. And that might just depend on where the study was done. Local architecture and the local landscape could make up those differences. But one thing that all the studies agree on is that high rises are actually responsible for very few of the collisions. So what does make a difference in a building is the amount of glass that's in a building. So here's some examples. One of them, you probably recognize the big house on the edge of Dow's Lake that's got huge expanses of windows, and it's got glass railings all the way around, and it's on the edge of Dow's Lake. So it's in Commissioner's Park. So it's got lots of greenery around it and lots of bird activity. There's a log home that you can see straight through. Again, lots of glass. So that's going to be a lethal building as well. And there's a shot from downtown where you can see two buildings, and you can see the contrast of one building that has windows, but they're just not really that obvious, and the other one that's just all mirrored glass. So it's easy to tell which of those buildings is going to be more dangerous, and our stats would bear that out. Another contributing factor for what makes buildings dangerous is the design of the building itself. So often you get these buildings that have either because of landscaping or because of the design of the building itself. So in the top case, it's more the landscaping than anything else. And in the bottom, it's the structure of the building. You get these designs that sort of funnel birds towards the glass. So in the top picture, birds are just naturally sort of going to be flying between the trees there. And then they sort of get the idea that they might be able to fly between two buildings there, not realizing that that part in the middle is actually glass. And in the bottom photo, you've got a building that has this big inset area as well that's transparent glass. That again, birds that end up in that area are going to think that they can continue flying straight through, and they can't. Other design traps like that are courtyards. You know, you can have glassed in courtyards and atria and things like that. They can also trap birds in them. And once the birds are in an area like that, it's really hard for them to find their way out again. And another contributing factor is, well, generally when you have more bird activity, you're going to have more bird collisions. So if you're going out of your way to attract birds to your yard, for example, by putting up feeders or by having a water feature like a bird bath or a little pond, but also just having natural food sources around, that's going to attract more birds. And now Safe Wings doesn't want people to stop feeding birds or put in ponds or plant native plants. We really would like you especially to plant lots of native plants because that's good for birds. It's just that if you do have more bird activity, you have a higher risk of having collisions. So it's important to take precautions to make the area safe for birds. Some other dangers that I want to touch on that are not necessarily related to collisions, but they're also threats to birds, and often things that people don't realize and that they can do something about. So window wells are one. You know, you think, well, if a bird falls down a window well, what's the big deal? It can just fly out. Well, often the birds that end up down in the window wells are young birds that are still learning to fly, and they just can't get out on their own. So we do actually get a lot of calls about birds in window wells. And you can solve that problem so that if a little bird does end up in the window well, it can get out again by having sort of a stepped structure like you see in the lower right. Or you can have a cover on your window well so that birds don't end up in there in the first place. And it's not just birds, it's also small mammals and things like that. Frogs and stuff like that can get trapped in window wells. Open pipes and flues and vents and chimneys and things like that, those also trap birds. You get a lot of cavity nesters that are looking for a place just like that, that they can build their nest or just go and roost in. So in fact, there's a lot of birds that end up trapped inside chimneys inside. We get a lot of calls about birds in fireplaces. because they've gone into the chimney. And once they get into a small narrow pipe like that, they can get in easily enough. And if it was a tree cavity, they could, turn themselves around because they could grip onto the sides. But with a smooth pipe like that, they can't do that. So they end up getting stuck. You see there's a photo of that garden gazebo there. And you think, well, how on earth can that trap a bird? Well, it turns out that often the legs on those are pipes. So they're open at the top. If they're not closed off at the top, again, you're going to get birds that end up in there. And we know about this sort of anecdotally. And one of our volunteers was telling the story about how she knew somebody who had one like this, and they took it down at the end of the season, and they found a whole stack of chickadees inside one of the legs of their gazebo. So the chickadees, being curious, had gone in through the top and then weren't able to get out again, which is kind of tragic. So it's a really good idea to look for those kinds of pipes and vents and things like that, where birds might end up inside and getting trapped, and capping them by putting a screen over it, or there's actual chimney caps that you can get, or screens that go onto vent outlets and things like that to keep birds from getting trapped in there. Mesh and netting. Often mesh is put up on balconies to keep the pigeons out or other birds, but then it's not maintained and they can get in, but then they can't get out again. You also see netting that's used. It's used on sports fields. There's an owl that got stuck in I think a soccer net. But you also see netting like that to protect strawberries and things. And it's, of course, you don't want the birds eating all your fruit, I guess, but it's a good thing to keep that maintained, keep an eye on it, because we have also gotten calls about birds caught with like a leg trapped in garden netting like that. And then there's light pollution. I said we were going to touch on that. So that is another contributing factor to collisions. And the reason for that is that a lot of birds migrate at night, and they're using the moon and the stars to navigate. And when there's artificial light coming from not just cities, it can be from anywhere, they get disoriented by that and they might be attracted to that. So this photo here shows the tribute to light on the site of the World Trade Center in New York. And it's the memorial that was built there. And it's basically these lights, very, very bright lights that shine straight up into the night sky. And of course, it's lit around September 11th, 9/11, which is peak migration for songbirds. And all those little specks that you see in those beams of light are birds. And what birds do, they're attracted to that kind of light and they fly around in it, and they can't leave. It's like moths to a flame, right? And they get trapped in that light and they'll just fly around until they crash into each other, they crash into buildings, or they just drop from exhaustion. And the problem is so bad in New York that the Audubon Society actually had to step in, and they started monitoring these lights. And when it got to a critical point, like you see here, when there's just so many birds in there, they shut off the lights. So that's sort of an extreme example of light pollution and how that affects birds. But any kind of lights sort of have the same effect. So just even the glow from a city will disorient the birds, and it will draw them into that built environment. People used to think that birds collided a lot during the night because of the light pollution. That does happen, but in fact, most of the collisions are in the early hours of the day, after the birds have been drawn into the city by the light pollution. And then when the sun comes up and they are being active, they want to start foraging, they're moving around, they find themselves surrounded by all these glass buildings. And that's when most of the collisions actually occur. We can mitigate light pollution, just like we can, make the glass less dangerous to birds as well. Using warmer colored lights is actually much better. So when you think more of the tone of an incandescent bulb versus a really bright LED bulb, people love LED lights because they're very energy efficient, but they actually produce a very, very focused light that's harder on the eyes. And there's been research done onto this and how that affects humans as well as wildlife. All light pollution does, but LEDs are especially bad because of this very, very bright white light. And if you think of, You know, if you're standing in a very brightly lit area under LED bulbs and you're going to see everything around you really well, you're not going to see anything that's past that light. And if you step out of that light for a minute, you're going to be blind for a minute because your eyes have to adjust to it. So despite what many people think, having more lights and brighter lights doesn't actually make things more safe and secure. Having less light is actually safer because your eyes do accustom to a warmer light, a softer light. Ways that we can reduce the effects of light pollution are to just use less light, obviously, but also to use special fixtures that are approved by the Dark Sky Association that shield the light so that they reduce what we call light spillage. So the light is kept where it's needed, and you're not lighting up everything else and causing more light pollution. You can also install motion sensors and timers so that the lights are only on when they're needed. And it's important to know that, yeah, it's not just the big, huge lights in the big cities that are causing the problem. Even a single porch light has been shown to affect wildlife. So, just take a drink. So let's talk about how we can prevent these collisions from happening. So with new buildings, we're lucky these days we actually have some tools, and one of them is the City of Ottawa's Bird Safe Design Guidelines that came out last year that we participated, we helped develop these. And in 2019, the Canadian Standards Association came out with a national standard for bird safe design. And what these guidelines and standards do is essentially give the builders, the architects, the designers, specific instructions on how to make buildings safer for birds. So now we can point to these documents when, we're building a new building, even if it's a new house or if it's a big building, people can now point to these things and say, I want this building to meet this standard. And that's a really useful thing. The thing is with the Ottawa guidelines, they are voluntary. And that's because our city has a different charter than the City of Toronto. The City of Toronto has mandatory guidelines. They've been world leaders in bird safe design and in requiring that. Ottawa's lagging a little bit behind, and we only have voluntary guidelines because that's all the city can actually force people to pay attention to, but they can't actually force them to do it. It would be nice to change that. There's people who are working on adding bird safe design to the National Building Code and the provincial codes that trickle down from that. So there's actually a petition online for adding bird safe design to the Ontario Building Code, if people want to look that up and sign that. That would be great because that would ensure that every new building that is built has birds in mind. And those bird safe design guidelines will, there's different ways of meeting the requirements for that. And here's some examples of that. So you've got a building that has louvers built into it. So it's also shading from the sun, and they're adjustable. And it's hiding the windows in a way. People can see out of that building, but the louvers are sort of obscuring a lot of the glass. You have patterned glass. There's translucent frosted glass that can be used. The building in the lower left is a building in Chicago that actually uses the balconies that project from the sides of the building. They act to reduce the view of the glass to birds and to make it safe for them. So there's any number of ways that architects can actually tackle this problem. It just, they need to be creative and think about it. Then there's building materials that can be used. So you can see some etched glass in one photo on the top left. I don't know if people recognize the photo on the top right. That is a new addition on the Rosemount Library, where they used patterned glass. It's also an etched glass, I believe. So those are both types of glass that are made to be bird safe with a pattern in them that the birds can see. You also see here just metal balcony railings. Seems like such an old-fashioned idea now to just have non-glass railings, but they're perfectly safe for birds. We encourage them. Also, you know, decorative glass, glass blocks, in fact, work as well, because they don't really have, like, they're so thick that they kind of muddle the view through them. So these are just examples, but there's lots of other things that can be used that are going to be safe for birds. There's integrated features. So louvers, you know, that can, again, do shade from the sun and protect birds, screening, exterior shades on windows, the wood slats. The top right photo is, that's the University of British Columbia. And those are basically metal grills that were installed with plants growing up them. And they weren't actually installed to protect birds. They were installed to provide shade as part of energy efficiency. They just have the added benefit that they're also safe for birds. Here's a local example of a building that was designed to be safe for birds. It's the STEM complex at the University of Ottawa. It might not be super obvious from this photo, but the glass, I mean, you can see a lot of the glass is opaque. Some of it looks like it might be reflective, but close up, it actually has little dots all over it. They're just not as obvious from a distance. And so that glass is safe for birds because any reflections are going to be disrupted or they're totally eliminated by the opaque glass. It still allows a lot of natural light into the building. It reduces the glare. So one of the problems we have with these all glass buildings is that, you know, people who work in offices, back when people worked in offices, I guess, but also in homes, you know, often there's a problem with glare. You can't see your computer screen because it's so bright. So this design of this building, that's not an issue. And it's a pretty neat looking building on top of it. So that's one of our favorite examples. We don't have a lot of examples of bird safe buildings yet in Ottawa, or ones that have been specifically built to be bird safe, but this is a recent one and it's one of our favorites. Here's another one. So this was actually not a new building. It was a major retrofit of Placevel, which is across from the courthouse on Elgin Street. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So this has a combination of patterned glass. You see in the top photo, there's these thin horizontal lines. So they're on the outside of the glass. That's very safe for birds. We can't take any credit for this building being bird safe. It was the architect's idea. And the owners of the building thought that was a nice idea as well. So they went with that. So it has this combination of this patterned glass, and it also has frosted glass in other areas. And it's a really nice looking building. It has lots of natural light still. We're really happy and surprised to see that go up. We didn't know that it was happening until, you know, I was going by there one day and I thought, wow, that looks like they're putting in bird safe glass. That's really interesting. So I looked into it and found out that that's exactly what it was, and it was done on purpose. So those are buildings that were designed to be bird safe, but there's an awful lot of buildings that are already standing that are not bird safe. And so what can we do about those to make them safer for birds? Well, for just about every kind of structure, there is a solution, whether that's a big glass office building like the one on the top, or a little bungalow on the bottom that has lots of glass in it as well. So some of the easy things to do, they're not always going to solve the problem entirely, but if you just want to do something quickly because birds are colliding, one of them is to move indoor plants away from the windows. You don't have to hide them in a closet somewhere. You just have to not have them right in the window where they're so obvious to the birds. You could also, hang sheer curtains between the plants and the windows as well. That would still let in enough light, but obscure the view from outside of the plants a little bit. Closing curtains and blinds, it's not a foolproof thing. It can help with the transparency problem. So it doesn't break up reflections, but say you've got corner windows or you have windows that face each other that the birds can see through. Closing the curtains or the blinds can make a difference there. And if you have blinds and you leave the slats open, that can actually add some visual noise. So it might actually help a little bit with reflections as well. We don't tell people to, rely on this as a foolproof way to stop collisions, because it won't, but in certain situations it can be helpful. And another thing is placing bird feeders and bird baths so that they're very close to the windows, which sounds counterintuitive because people think, well, you're putting it right next to the dangerous thing. But if you have a bird feeder on the window, like in this photo, the birds are flying to the feeder. And in fact, one of the reasons that birds collide with windows at homes is because people are putting feeders, say 10 to 20 feet away from the window, and they're feeding, they're eating away, having a great time. And then a Cooper's hawk comes along, or a merlin, or a cat, or whatever it is, and the birds fly off in a panic. If they're about, 10 feet away from a window, there's a high chance they're going to fly into that window because they don't have time to think about where they're going. They're just trying to get out of there. If the feeder is right on the window, first of all, they're more likely to fly away from the building from where they've just been. The other thing is if they did hit the window, they wouldn't have built up enough momentum to hurt themselves if the feeder is close to the window. So the ideal distance is under 50 centimeters, so 1.5 feet away. People used to always also say that it's also safe if a bird feeder is at least 30 feet away. It turns out that's not exactly true. So that number comes from a study that was done by Dr. Dan Clem, who's a sort of world leading authority on bird collisions, who started researching this back in the 1970s. So he did a study where he tested the risk of bird collisions based on how far feeders were away from windows. And he found that indeed under 50 centimeters was safest. Where that 30-foot number came from is that that's how far he went in his study. He tested feeders at different distances from windows, and he stopped at 30 feet just because he had to stop somewhere. So that got interpreted by some people as saying that if the feeder is over 30 feet away, it's safe. So that's not actually true, unfortunately. One thing is that if it is 30 feet away, but it's not really in a direct line of view of the window, that will be safer. But just if you hear that number, and we used to say that in the past as well, because that was just the number that went around. It was between 18 inches and 30 feet was where you shouldn't have feeders. But if you had it less than 18 inches or more than 30 feet, it was safe. So I just like to bring that up because I think even our old brochures have the 30-foot figure, and it's just not accurate. Now you know why. So one of the best ways to make your own windows or any windows safer for birds is to have a pattern on the glass that is visible to the birds. So this is one way that you can do that with visual markers. And this example is a visual marker tape that's made by a Canadian company called Feather Friendly. And it basically comes like a roll of tape. You can see that being applied on the window on the left. And then you peel away the tape and it leaves behind these little white dots on the outside of the glass. The photo on the right is a view from inside. I have heard a few people say that, it makes them dizzy or something, but most people don't really even notice those dots once they're installed. We have them on our windows here at home. They've been up for about 5 years, I think 6 years. And nobody even ever notices them. People who come over, back when people used to come over, and we don't notice them ourselves. They're just, it's like having a screen on your windows, so you don't really notice, because they're just small dots, are about 1/4 of an inch wide, and they're spaced 2 inches apart. And they work extremely well to prevent collisions. And that's something that anybody can install. It's like a DIY product. There's also, they make a commercial version of the same product, but you can have any kind of custom designed film that will have the same effect to break up those reflections and the transparency. There's something called Kaleidoscape, but it's essentially perforated film or bus wrap. You see it used for advertising, you see it in store windows a lot. That can be just applied as a solid sheet, like in the lower left photo. There's a local example of somebody who put up this, that's just perforated film, and it looks like it's solid from here. And from the outside, it looks totally opaque, and you don't see any reflections, you don't see through that window at all. And the photo just immediately to the right of that is a view from inside. So again, it's like a little bit like having a screen on your window. But the difference with the perforated film is that it's opaque from the outside and it's pretty much transparent from the inside, and still lets in most of the light. Another thing you can do with that same perforated film is to cut it into patterns, like in the top left photo. That's the Earth Ranger station in Southern Ontario, where they basically cut out this perforated film into a forest design. They have another window that has feathers all over it that are made with that same type of film. And that's also a very effective thing. The only thing with perforated film is that if you have a problem with light pollution at night, the light, if a building is lit up from the inside with perforated film, it's going to appear transparent from the outside at night, not during the day, but just at night. So something to bear in mind. And there's any number of other types of decorative film that you can get at a hardware store or whatever to put on windows that is going to make them safer for birds. Then there's exterior screens. Some people are lucky enough to already have exterior screens on their windows. And those will definitely break up reflections and help with the transparency problem as well. But they do have to be exterior screens. If your screens are on the insides of your windows, it's not going to make a difference, unfortunately. Another solution is to make a sort of curtain of paracord or any kind of string, as long as it's 1/8 of an inch thick at least, that hangs in front of the windows. Some people will just take lengths of paracord and hang it from something at the top of the window, but you can also secure it at the bottom of the window, and then it sways less in the breeze. It's a bit of a cleaner look. It's sort of a matter of preference, but that's sort of a very cheap and easy thing that you can do, and you can actually find the instructions for doing this online. And here's a couple of other examples of people just being really creative. So one thing you can use is liquid chalk markers, which you can get at Staples or Walmart or whatever. They come in different colors. That's a temporary thing. That liquid chalk is the same stuff that's often used to decorate store windows. When you see drawings and squiggles and writing and stuff on the outsides of store windows, that's done with liquid chalk. It does wipe off, so it would probably have to be replaced depending on how exposed it is to the weather. On the left-hand side, you have something that was done with an oil-based paint marker. Sharpie sells them, or in theory they do, but there's other companies that sell them as well. And if you have a marker like that, that's at least where the tip of it is at least 1/8 of an inch wide, you can draw a design on your windows. Some people will project an image onto the glass and then trace that, or freehand. It's nice to have some artistic talent for that. And that's a fairly permanent solution. They did a whole enormous set of windows at the University of British Columbia with this type of design. And they did that a couple of years ago, and people are sort of waiting to see how long it lasts. But it's oil paint, so in theory it should be fairly permanent, although you could scrape it off. So if your artistic talent is not what you hoped it would be, you can always correct your mistakes by scraping it off with a blade and starting over again. So all of these solutions, what they have in common to be effective is that they have to follow these 4 rules. And that's that you have to have a pattern. It doesn't matter what the pattern is. It can be dots or stripes or anything that you want. But the pattern has to meet these criteria. You want to have a maximum of 2-inch spacing between your pattern elements. There again, if you look at older information on preventing bird collisions, people will talk about 4-inch spacing or 2x4-inch spacing. But the research is always being updated on this, and what we have found is that 2 inches is the ideal maximum spacing, because that will also prevent collisions by small birds. So 4-inch spacing or 2x4-inch spacing might prevent collisions by larger birds, but it won't prevent kinglets and wrens and hummingbirds and other small birds from colliding. You want your visual markers to be ideally 1/4 of an inch in diameter so that they're visible enough to the birds. And you want it to be on the outside of the glass. And that's because anything that's on the inside of the glass, if the sun is reflecting off the surface of the glass, you're not going to be able to see it from outside. So it has to be on the exterior surface of the glass. And you want it to be high contrast. Now these dots in this image are red, but that's just for illustrative purposes. White is actually a really good color to use. And depending on the situation, black is also very good as well. But pretty much anything as long as it has a high contrast, so it's going to be visible in different light conditions. So these rules are not made to be broken, because if you break these rules, then you might find that you've put a lot of effort into trying to protect birds and fail at it. And we have an excellent example of that in Ottawa, right here in Ottawa, and that's the National Arts Centre. So that building was supposed to be bird friendly when they did the renovation. Excuse me, my cat has decided to join us. It was meant to be bird safe. We had suggested that to the National Capital Commission that was in charge of the project and the people at the National Art Center, and they thought that was a great idea. Let's make it bird safe. So they told the architects that they had to make it bird safe, but they didn't specify because, you know, there was no national standard yet. Ottawa did not have bird safe design guidelines that they could point to. So they said they would look at other guidelines from other places. And what the architects did was look at some very old guidelines, and then they sort of compromised on that. They watered it down essentially. So instead of, you know, 2-inch spacing between the pattern elements, these markers that you can see on this glass are actually 11 inches apart. So that's not going to stop a lot of birds from flying between them. And the reason that spacing is so important is because, you know, birds can actually fly very well. So if you have wide spaces between the pattern elements like that, they'll just fly between them or think that they can fly between them. So that was one count on which the National Art Center renovation failed. The other one is that they put these markers on the inside surface of the glass. And the main problem there on the north facade is reflections of the trees. And you just can't see those markers that are on the glass front under a lot of light conditions. They also made them low contrast. They're beige. It's not evident again from that photo that's taken from inside the building. But they made this pattern beige. Why? The architect said, well, they wanted it to blend in with the original concrete of the building. Now, of course, if it blends in, it's probably not going to be very visible, right? So as a result, this building that was the renovation that was supposed to be safe for birds, instead we ended up with a building that kills what we estimate 300 to 460 or so birds per year. And that was a building that previously really didn't kill very many birds, you know, with the big concrete, the brutalist structure. People who research bird collisions are big fans of brutalist architecture, it turns out, because, you know, there's less glass and more concrete. Anyway, so this is a really good example of why it's important to follow those rules. You know, people have been studying this now for close to 50 years. We know what works and we know what doesn't. And the reason that there's guidelines that are written the way they are is because we know that that's what's going to prevent collisions. And if you try to compromise on that, it's not going to work. It's not the same as, say, compromising on insulation in a building, you know, when you're trying to make it energy efficient and you go, well, ideally we should have an R value of, you know, 20, but, you know, if we go with 10, that'll still be pretty good. There's still a benefit to that. The problem with bird safe design is that if you compromise on it, it's not like it'll just be, you know, it'll still be kind of good. It's that you might find that it really has no effect at all. And that really is the case with the National Art Center. Now, I am happy to report that I just got an email from them. I was looking for an update on what, you know, we've been talking to them about what they can do about actually making this building bird safe. And it sounds like they are actually going to do something about that. So that's really great news. So here's some other things that don't work. Silhouettes. Birds don't see that hawk silhouette as a predator. They just see a black blob and they'll just try to fly around it. Any kind of decals like that, if they're spaced too widely apart, aren't going to work. Oh, and here we've lost part of an image. That's interesting. Okay, so this is supposed to show UV decals, but you know, they're kind of invisible on glass too. So I guess that sort of works here. And UV, there's UV liquid that you can use also that's sold to presumably to prevent collisions, but those things fade. And again, you'd have to space them, put so many of them up that it's going to obscure your view. And the problem with any kind of UV products is that not all birds can see UV light. And the other thing is that most collisions occur early in the morning. And if you think about, you know, in the summertime when it gets really bright and sunny, you get the UV report, and the UV light levels are always highest at the middle of the day. That's not when you need to prevent collisions. It's early in the morning when you have to do that. So the images on the right, also not really explained well since half the slide is missing here. I apologize for that. That's something that's called UV glass. So it's glass that has a UV pattern that's embedded in it. And in theory, I mean, the marketing says that we just don't see, we just see normal glass. We can't see any kind of pattern there at all. But the birds are going to see this busy pattern that's in the lower photo, in theory. But we understand so little of how birds actually see things that, you know, that claim is not really based on much. And in fact, you know, this type of glass has tested well in certain types of studies. So the American Bird Conservancy, for example, studies different bird safe products in a tunnel. And it's sort of artificial conditions. And they found that this type of UV reflecting glass actually works fairly well. But then other people have done studies in real life conditions in the field. And in fact, it's been installed on certain buildings. The Canadian Wildlife Service installed this type of glass in a couple of their facilities. And they found that they actually had more collisions. So unless there's some great big developments that are made in UV products like this, and people can prove that they actually do work and don't cause more collisions, we just really cannot recommend these products. And it's unfortunate because it's sort of the holy grail for people. They think, oh, it's great, it's invisible to us, but the birds can see it, except it just doesn't work in our experience, or doesn't work reliably well enough to justify the huge cost for these products. Oh, well, there's the rest of the slide. So there you see the window alert decals, which are ubiquitous. They're very easy to find online or in stores, and everybody thinks they're great for preventing collisions, and they're not. They fade, they need to be replaced very often, and you'd have to put up so many of them to be effective that it's not going to work. And the UV liquid, I think somebody tried that at Fletcher Wildlife Garden, and they said, well, it's just very runny and you can't see it. And the birds don't see it either. So that was everything about collisions and why they happen and how to prevent them. And I just want to talk a little bit about what Safe Wings exactly has been doing on this front. So one of the main things that we do is monitor buildings to look for collision victims. We pick up the dead ones, we rescue the live ones when we can, and we collect data on the collisions. We note the date and the time and the address and the side of the building and other things that might be relevant to give us a better understanding of why collisions are happening, where they're happening, when. And we record the species because that gives us a better sense of what birds are most vulnerable. And we put all of this information together, and there's a lot of other groups like ours in other cities, and together we've built a much better picture of window collisions. So that's one of the main things that our volunteers do. It's very time consuming, but without this, we can't actually really demonstrate how big the problem is or what the problem is exactly. So this gives us a lot of leverage to be able to try to ask for change. We've done a lot of work with various levels of government. We've worked with the City of Ottawa in developing the bird safe design guidelines, also some other initiatives we've worked on with them. We've been working with OC Transpo on making the bus shelters bird safe, also the LRT stations, which are really, really, really awful. This is work in progress. We've worked with the National Capital Commission. They have also released bird safe design guidelines. I think they're going to be approved very soon if they haven't already been. And we've worked with them. The building, I don't know if you recognize that in the upper right-hand side, is Visitor Center at Gatineau Park in Old Chelsea. And that's been treated with feather-friendly dots to make it safe for the birds. And we've been doing various things with Environment and Climate Change Canada and PSPC, what used to be known as Public Works, to try to make federal buildings more bird friendly as well. So that's sort of something that we've been working a lot on in the last few years, and actually getting results with bird safe design guidelines and other initiatives. We do a lot of outreach and education. One of the things that Safe Wings did in the last couple of years, we released last year, was the Ottawa Bird Strategy. And we worked with Nature Canada and Birds Canada and the Wild Bird Care Center. There's some other partners like the The National Capital Commission supported us and reviewed things for us. And basically, this is a document that looks at various threats to birds, not just window collisions, but various threats to birds, but also opportunities in ways that we can protect them and why we should protect them. You can find it on our website. It's a really good read, I think. We also work a lot with property owners and managers to try to get them to retrofit their buildings to make them safer, and also just to help us collect data on collisions so that we can understand them. Some building owners don't want to know anything about the collisions. And in fact, there's an example of one building that said, well, there never used to be so many collisions until one of our volunteers started looking for birds, which is a strange kind of logic. We try to do outreach with architects and builders. There's a lot more work to be done on that front, especially when you think of there's still a lot of glass buildings going up. There's still glass railings going up everywhere. We try to have a good presence on social media, just educating people from all walks of life about it, bringing attention to the problem of bird collisions, but other threats to birds as well. We used to do the annual bird display. We're still trying to figure out a way to do that this year, because that's really a good way to open people's eyes to the scope of the problem. And we do other public events. We've done school and community presentations. Anyway, we're active on a lot of fronts with the outreach and the education. We have a whole advocacy subcommittee these days that just looks at new developments that are applications that are going in and looking for ones that might be problematic and reaching out to the planners and to the builders and stuff. So that's something that I'm very proud of that we've been working on a lot lately. We have a hotline. We answer the phone from 6 a.m. until 11 p.m., 7 days a week, and take a lot of calls about collisions, but we take a lot of calls about other birds in distress as well. So there's examples here. There's a couple of our volunteers. There's Willow with, I'm not sure who that is, Billy, I think, that they've caught an injured goose. And there's an arborist who's renesting baby merlin for us. And there's me having caught a duck that had a fishing lure stuck in its leg. And there's Christina who's answering the phone. We get a remarkable number of calls. We had no idea it would be this popular when we started. We get a few thousand calls a year, no lie. And we're often giving people advice on what to do about birds, how to rescue them. We're trying to send out our own volunteers to help with rescues when we can. And a lot of it is just, telling people what they need to do and how to get the bird to the help that it needs. And the help that it needs is usually to get to a rehabber. So this also wasn't really our plan when we started out that we would become rehabbers, because we do have the Wild Bird Care Center, but it turns out there's just so much demand for injured birds to care for them. And also we've sort of found a niche as specialists in dealing with window collisions. So we only provide short-term care for the most part. Birds that have more complex injuries, if they have broken bones and things like that, still tend to go to the Wild Bird Care Center or to other places like the Owl Foundation in Southern Ontario, or to the Nichoir in Hudson, to Sandy Pines Wildlife Center in Napanee for longer-term care. As much as possible, though, we try to rehabilitate and release birds ourselves. And you can see just these are some of our patients, I think, all from last year. And I think these are all window collisions, in fact, but we do take in birds that have been injured by other means, cat attacks and hit by cars, or they're sick, or they got tangled in something. Last year, we admitted 1,427 patients. There's myself and another one of our volunteers, Christina Hupe, who basically are set up now as home-based rehabbers, taking in birds at any time of the day pretty much, and doing what we can to help them. So what can you do to help them? Well, you can make your own home safe for birds by putting up Feather Friendly or some other product to prevent collisions. You can see my friend Karen there, who's having a great time installing Feather Friendly on their windows. And the final product looks pretty good. We have lots of information on our website on the different solutions. and where to get products and how to apply them and stuff like that. So check that out. Also, not just your windows, also treat your railings, please, if you have clear railings. If you don't live in a single family dwelling, but live in a condo, or you go to school, or you work in an office building and there's a problem with collisions, you can monitor for those collisions. You can report collisions to us. You can talk to the building owner, manager, your condo board, your landlord, whoever, and come up with solutions on how to save birds. The top photo is a condo complex in LeBreton Flats. And you see they have those nice glass railings, these sort of wind screens that project from the side of the building, where they found they had a problem with birds colliding. And so people who live there, who are on the condo board, brought up the idea of, hey, maybe we can do something to fix this problem. And so they did. There's still more work to be done at that building, but they've made a great start by putting feather friendly on some of those glass panels there to reduce the collisions there. And that's great. And that's a great initiative to see, because we are finding that a lot of the new condo buildings do have a lot of glass and are a problem. And often people think, well, it's a condo, we can't do anything. Well, it's not true, because if you can get your neighbors on board and convince the condo board to do something, then maybe you can. Safe Wings is always available to provide advice on how to make buildings safer for birds. We can provide supplies, like you see our paper bags here that have instructions on them. We're happy to help, because we want to protect birds, so we want to help other people protect birds as well. You can also help birds by talking to other people about bird collision prevention, about the problem and what they can do to stop it. You can advocate for bird safe buildings, for bird safe landscaping, and for reducing light pollution. Here's that petition I mentioned for updating the Ontario Building Code to incorporate bird safe design. And you can contact elected officials, your councillor, the mayor. You can, if there's a building going up in your neighborhood that you're concerned about, you can submit comments, you can attend public consultations. And if you have the opportunity, if you're in that position, talk to architects and builders and other people who have influence on what our buildings look like. These efforts, they do actually make a difference. I mean, one of the reasons that we managed to get bird safe design guidelines in Ottawa is because of those kinds of efforts. It's one of the reasons that the new public library looks like it will be bird safe. We have some concerns still about light pollution and stuff, but certainly the design is much better than it might have been. And we continue with more of these projects, and people really help us with this, and people support what we're saying and reach out to the councillor, to the mayor. It does really make a big difference. And on a bigger scale, like in the US right now, they've been passing legislation to protect birds as well. And even we here in Canada can often comment on those things and help pass that legislation. Other ways you can help are helping Safe Wings with our documentation of collisions. Like I said, that's a very important part of what we do. It's not always a lot of fun to be collecting dead birds, but it is incredibly important. So if you ever do see a dead bird, pick it up immediately if you can. Don't leave it there, because it will be eaten by a scavenger or predator, or somebody will toss it aside. You put it in a bag and call us. If you can pick it up, and not everybody is always in a position to pick up a dead bird, you can at least hide it somewhere, like in a planter, and call us and let us know where we can find it, and we'll go and pick it up within reason. We probably won't go pick it up if it's in Rockland or something like that, and we don't have a volunteer nearby. If you do find a bird like that, note the date, the time, the address, and the side of the building, because that's all information that we want. And take a photo. If you can't take the bird itself, taking a photo is also very helpful. And one thing people worry about is like, well, I don't have any rubber gloves with me. Well, handling birds like this is generally very, very low risk. You probably want to wash your hands afterwards. But in fact, most of the birds that are dying from collisions they're not sick birds. They're the most healthy birds. So the ones that are migrating, they're strong, and they were super healthy until they hit that glass. Live birds, those are more fun to pick up. bit more challenging to pick up too, though. The best advice there is to not hesitate. If you see a bird that you can pick up, it probably needs help. The only exception is young birds that are still learning to fly can sometimes be easy to approach and to pick up. But in most cases, a wild bird that's approachable and can be picked up needs help. So you should just do it as quickly as possible. The longer you wait, the more chance it will fly away. And we don't want that to happen. You can pick up a bird with both hands or one hand. You can use a towel or a net if you have that available to drop over the bird and then pick it up in that. Most birds are not going to do, not going to bite you. They might screech. It's surprising sometimes how tiny little warblers and that will make a very loud sound to scare you off. But there are some birds that you do have to be careful with, like herons, loons, cormorants, birds of prey. So birds that are either stabby or that they have very strong talons, and they can do some damage. Then you'd want to have leather gloves or call us and we can advise on how best to pick that up. We don't want anybody to risk themselves to save a bird, but there are generally ways of picking up a bird safely. When you do pick up an injured bird, make sure you get it into a bag or a box immediately. Close the bag or the box. Don't let the bird get away, and keep it in a quiet place. Catch the bird first, get it contained, then call Safe Wings so that we can figure out what the next steps should be. Don't handle an injured bird more than you absolutely have to, because they're not, if a bird just sits in your hand, it's not because it's friendly, it's because it's terrified and helpless. So you don't want to handle it more than you have to, because you don't want to make loud noises. You don't want to try to feed it. You don't want to take photos of it. You don't want to make a lot of noise, because all these things can actually kill an injured bird. They're very susceptible to that. So you caught the bird and you got it into a box or a paper bag and starting to get active. It seems like it's okay. Can you let it go? No, don't let it go. If you release the bird, it might be able to fly away. It may seem like it's okay. And in fact, a lot of the advice that people used to get from rehabbers, if they found a bird that hit a window, was to put it in a box in a quiet place and let it sit for an hour or two and then see if it will fly away. That sounds really nice, but unfortunately, since then, a lot of us have learned that birds that hit windows usually do have serious injuries. At the very least, they have a concussion, and they often have other things. They have brain bleeds, they have neurological problems, they have vision loss, all these things. And a lot of these symptoms are not obvious immediately, and they won't prevent a bird from flying away. So there's a couple of examples here. One of them is a little brown creeper on the bottom left. We had a creeper, I don't remember if it's this one exactly, but it seemed pretty lively, and it could fly, but I think it was poor weather or something. It was kind of stormy weather. So we decided, well, it's eating, so let's keep it another day and we'll see if we can release it tomorrow. And the next day we went to pick it up and we found out it had blown up like a little balloon, because it had damaged, probably from a broken bone or something like that. Birds have very complex respiratory systems, and they have air sacs in them. They're kind of like lungs, and those can burst. So this poor little bird had all this air that was building up under its skin. And we see this a fairly common injury, in fact, from window collisions. And it often doesn't show up for 24 hours or more. So if we had released the bird when we thought it seemed fine, it would have flown away, but then it would have been completely incapacitated. It wouldn't have been able to eat. It would have been very vulnerable to predators. So we're really glad that we kept it, and it eventually did recover and was released after a few weeks of care. There's another photo there. It looks like a demonic pine grosbeak. It's not actually demonic. It has blood inside the eye. And that was another injury that did not appear for many hours after the collision. And that kind of injury, that also did clear up. But while the eye is like that and it has blood pooling inside it, it can't see out of that eye. So those are just a couple of examples of the types of injuries that we see. And they're the reason that we don't counsel people to release birds after a collision, even if they seem like they're okay, because often they're not. By taking a bird to a rehabber, and Safe Wings does specialize in window collisions, We can make sure that the birds get anti-inflammatory medications. We could give them oxygen. Oxygen therapy is really useful for head trauma or for other types of respiratory distress. And we make sure that they're eating properly. And then they have a safe place to recover. And that actually saves a lot of birds. And well, that pretty much wraps it up about window collisions and safe wings and what you can do. There's our phone number. We encourage people to keep that number handy, put it into your phone, program it into your phone. And then if you ever do find a bird in distress, you can give us a call. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anouk. Very interesting presentation. Very informative, educational. Thank you. Jacob, you want to add something?
Yeah, well, I want to know if anybody has questions. Can you take some questions?
I can take some questions, sure.
Right, we don't have a lot of people on this time, so if you have a question, yeah. why don't you unmute yourself and anyone want to be brave? Okay, I have a couple of questions sent to me by chat here. If you can answer it. Right. What is the worst building in Ottawa for bird collisions, and what is being done to rectify that particular situation?
Well, we don't tend to talk too much about privately owned buildings that have a very serious problem, because we're trying to work with the owners. Although I think we've sort of reached the point with what we think is the worst building, that we haven't made a lot of headway with the owners. They haven't done anything and have basically told us they're not really all that interested in doing anything. So then I don't mind naming which building that is. And that's the 200 Kent Street, which is a DFO building at the corner of Kent Street and Laurier Avenue, which is a big cross-shaped glass building. It's all mirrored glass. Unfortunately, it wasn't a mirrored glass building when it was first built in the 1960s, but then it was renovated in the 1980s. And it used to be a condo building, and then it was turned into an office tower, and they covered it in mirrored glass. And one of the problems is because it has a cross shape. It's built across from St. Patrick's Cathedral or Basilica. I don't remember what that's. And I think the land used to belong to the church, and they like that design, that cross shape. But that creates a bunch of corners that trap birds. It's one of those design traps. And the building also has transparent areas, and it has these big mature trees in the churchyard across the street. So that's the building.
Okay. Do you have any partnerships with astronomy clubs to advocate together to improve lighting in cities for both birds and stargazing?
I mean, we're often sort of we're on the same page as those groups, like was it the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada? Mm-hmm. We follow each other on Twitter, and we support each other's messages. We haven't had any kind of official partnership with them, though. But there are in many places, I think, because it's sort of a mutual goal to reduce light pollution. There may not be a lot of formal partnerships, but there's a lot of support of each other's work.
And I asked that question, and can you tell me, is that part of the bird guidelines, friendly guidelines, to address the lighting situation too when they're designing? I know that was
yes, yeah. Light pollution is covered as well, and in most bird safe design guidelines, including the ones in Toronto, and the national building code that we're working on. I don't think it's going to cover light pollution right away, but that's often covered also just for energy efficiency reasons as well, that people are trying to reduce light pollution. But the Ottawa Bird Safe Design Guidelines do include that, and the National Capital Commission's Capital Illumination Plan also talks about light pollution, and they talk a lot about better lighting instead of more lighting.
Thank you. It was excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I had one more question, but I don't know if Jacob's going to read it.
I was going to, unless you want to just ask it, that's fine.
I have a question. Like I like the idea of the dots,
Mhm.
but does that not affect how you clean your windows? I mean, if you have to scrub them down to have the dots come off, or
No, I mean, you might lose a dot once in a while, but it sticks on pretty well.
okay, so it doesn't
Yeah.
interfere with cleaning.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a little bit harder to get, if you want a, sparkly, completely crystal clear finish with no streaks. I find it's a little bit more challenging when the dots are there. But I mean, people have been using feather friendly now it's been around for more than 10 years. And windows are still being washed, and it stands up to that.
Thank you.
All right. I don't have any more questions in the chat. Nobody else. Okay. So thank you very much again, Anouk, for that great presentation. I hope everybody's had time now to put the number in their phone, or at least write it down. But if you didn't get it, it's going to be there at safewings.ca. Pretty easy to remember. And you can also get linked to that page through the OF&C website as well.